My name is Anwar Majid. I'm the director of the Center for Global Humanities, and we host a series of events and lectures, seminars throughout the year that highlight and that address some of the critical issues facing humanity in the 21st century. And so whether it's the field of philosophy or history, literature, medicine even, and the sciences, they're all represented in the center. And today, and every year, we make sure to host some of our colleagues in other universities and colleges in the state of Maine. And today, we are absolutely delighted to host Dan Cohen, a professor of philosophy at Colby College, whose lecture promises to be very exciting indeed. So, and the title, as you all know, is How to Lose an Argument and Why, Exit Strategies for Political and Academic Warfare. And I see David here, probably interested in the term warfare. Professor Dan Cohen has taught philosophy at universities on 3 different continents, published in journals on 4 continents, and lectured on a total of 5 and counting. I mean, I don't know what the continents, but is it 5 continents? Yeah. But even though the path of his philosophical career has taken him literally around the world, it has flourished, and if he has his way, it will end here in Maine. Professor Cohen cannot claim to be a Mainer. That's what he told me, having been born through no fault of his own in New York City. But he made it here as soon as he could. He was introduced to Plato and Aristotle, Descartes and Spinoza, Hume and Kant, and the immensely compelling but even more exasperating Ludwig Wittgenstein as an undergraduate at Colby College in the 1970s. But he did not understand that they were to be lifelong partners in conversation until he found that their voices were constant companions with him during one particular walk he took in the woods. It was, however, a very long walk. After he graduated from Colby, he went down to Springer Mountain in Georgia and spent the next 5 months contemplating being and non-being while hiking the Appalachian Trail back to Maine, and realizing that he really would have to pursue graduate studies and a career in philosophy. Professor Cohen did his graduate work at Indiana University, writing a dissertation on the formal logic of conditionals. Don't ask me what that means. By a stroke of immense good fortune, a position opened up at Colby as he was finishing his PhD and was offered the job. Since returning to Maine, he has written a book on arguments and metaphors in philosophy and has published regularly in the top journals in the field. He has also assumed positions of responsibility within the academic community, serving as the book review editor for the Canadian Journal of Informal Logic, as a member of the advisory board for the Chilean journal Cogency, and as a referee for the journals from as far away as South Africa, the Netherlands, and Australia. Closer to home, he is on the executive board of the Association for Informal Logic and Critical Thinking. Professor Cohen's philosophical interest began befitting the mathematics major that he was, and we have another colleague, Professor Sararelli, who was a mathematics major in the graduate school, that he was, with formal logic. They have since broadened to include epistemology, philosophy of language, and argumentation theory, with Wittgenstein's voice following him every step of the way. And I'm sure it's going to trail us tonight, too. Thank you. So please help me.
Well, thank you for those kind words, overly generous words. Yeah, I'm guilty of, I think, most of those things. The focus of my talk this evening is going to be political argumentation, but I'm afraid that most of what I have to say is rather depressing. So you might want to leave now. If you're going to stay, you could move up too. That would be fine. In sum, what I want to say is this. Robust political argumentation is crucial to sustaining the health of a liberal, deliberative democracy. But as a nation, we're just not very good at it. We're not good at winning, we're worse at losing, and we just don't see any other options besides winning and losing. So the short-term prognosis for American democracy is bleak, with continued bipolarization and paralysis. In the long term, I think that the prognosis is actually even worse because our failings are symptomatic of deep, chronic, and degenerative conditions. I think the only rational response is a profound pessimism. But if you insist, I think optimism can be reasonable. Now, for optimism to be reasonable, while pessimism is rational, obviously rationality and reasonableness have to be distinguished. I think that the distinction does have some currency in legal contexts, as well as ethics and even in argumentation theory, but I don't think there's a clear difference is obvious in how we ordinarily use those terms. So let me have a brief digression and let me ask. I want to show of hands here. How many of you would rather be described as rational rather than reasonable? How many think that rational is better than reasonable? How many of you think that reasonable is better than rational? Clear preference for reasonableness here. It's interesting. For completeness, let me ask about the negative cases. How many of you think that it's better to be that irrational being irrational is worse than being unreasonable? Being irrational is worse. How many think being unreasonable is worse than being irrational? Interesting. Now, the data I've collected, and the show of hands here is more or less in line with that. The data I've collected here, show clear but statistically significant patterns favoring reasonableness over rationality. But the aversion to irrationality over unreasonableness is actually greater than the preference for reasonableness over rationality. I think three things stand out trying to explain this. First, in different ways and to different degrees, reason and rationality are highly gendered concepts. Second, they tend to merge on reflection. It's reasonable to be rational, and it's rational to be reasonable. They tend to merge. And third, these are ethically loaded concepts. Now, I think this comes into higher relief in the negative cases. Irrationality is seen as an inherent attribute of a person, while unreasonableness only comes into play when other people are around. Irrationality is conceived as a cognitive defect. Unreasonableness is partly social or even moral. In fact, I'd sum it up this way. If you're irrational, there's something wrong with your brain. But if you're unreasonable, there's something wrong with your soul. Now, I will use rationality here to refer to the pure means-end calculations of self-interested individuals. And I'll use reasonableness for parallel reasoning that takes into account others' interests as well. That's the distinction we need, and I think that's more or less in accord with its use in certain legal contexts where rational risk and reasonableness are certainly differentiated in product tort, for example, tort law. So my analysis of political argumentation is going to isolate these strands and other strands, some to highlight, some to downplay. Hopefully I'll be able to weave them back together by the end. No guarantees on that, I'll try. But the cognitive dimensions of our lives cannot be disentangled completely from ethics, from our values. Values are integral to cognition. And so is argumentation. Argumentation is, in Ralph Johnson's felicitous term, manifest rationality. And of course, political argumentation is thoroughly imbued with both argument and values. So, democracies need an informed and engaged body politic. But despite the proliferation of information sources and forms for communication, I don't think we qualify as well-informed, adequately informed, or adequately engaged in the relevant ways. Talk radio, blogs, Twitter feeds, and the like provide more outlets for political news and more opportunities for political dialogue than ever before. We're no longer confined to receiving news passively, shouting vainly at the television tube or writing unread letters to the editor trying to make ourselves heard. Things have changed. I mean, who could have thought even a couple of years ago that there'd be such a thing as logistically complicated as a Twitter revolution? I mean, it might be easier to voice our opinions now, but I don't see any evidence that we're better at listening We argue at each other, but we don't argue with each other. We argue without engagement. We have arguments without real argumentation. Now, political engagement is one of the responsibilities of a citizen in a deliberative democracy. Rather, let me rephrase that. It's two responsibilities, because we have to engage with the issues and we have to engage with each other. Now, to see the importance of these two separate responsibilities, contrast them with the limit cases, a total lack of engagement. Now, if we were completely uninformed about political matters, our votes would be no better than random, undercutting the positive part of democracy. Uninformed voters aren't doing anyone any favors. Fortunately, completely uninformed voters are pretty rare. Being informed comes in degrees, and plenty of things help us out. Things like party affiliation, what our friends think. I mean, even bumper stickers help out. The point remains, though, the duty to vote is not fulfilled merely by showing up at the polls and pulling a lever. Voting's not enough. What we need is informed voting. But even informed voting is not enough. We also need to engage with our fellow citizens. Healthy democracies need public argumentation. And the extreme case here would be, what? A polity of citizens who might be very knowledgeable about the issues, but who are politically isolated. They never talk politics with their fellow citizens. Their votes may be informed, but they're not informed by each other. That society would be a mere collection of individuals rather than a collective of citizens. Now, as deformed as that might seem, there's actually something appealing about it. There are passages in Plato and Locke and Rousseau that almost idealize that kind of fragmentation. Rousseau wrote, and let me quote here, "If, when an adequately informed people deliberates, the citizens were to have no communication among themselves, the general will would always result from the large number of small differences, and the deliberation would always be good. But when factors, partial associations at the expense of the large one, are formed, the will of each of these associations becomes general with reference to its members and particular with reference to the state." So what Rousseau's worried about here is that the political dialogue can have a corrupting influence on private deliberation. For Rousseau, the general will is something to be discovered rather than something to be constructed by argumentation. Special interest groups are wrenches in the workings of the democratic process rather than cogs in the machinery of democracy. Political argumentation allows for demagoguery and rhetoric in the worst sense of the word, the sense of the word that drove Locke to write, quoting now, "If we would speak of things as they are, we must allow that all the art of rhetoric, besides order and clearness, all the artificial and figurative application of words eloquence hath invented, are for nothing else than to insinuate wrong ideas, move the passions, and thereby mislead the judgment, and so indeed are perfect cheat." Now, the sense of rhetoric that Locke is attacking descends from Plato. He imputed it to the sophists in order to draw a stark contrast between what they were doing and Plato's own conception of philosophy. Now, if rhetoric is anything like the way Plato portrayed it, then evicting those silver-tongued propagandists of poets actually seems like a pretty rational idea. Well, it might be rational, but it's not reasonable. Aristotle didn't feel the same urgency about distancing himself from the sophists. For him, rhetoric was an ally, not a rival to logic. It's not the art of persuasion simpliciter. Rhetoric is the art of rational persuasion. There are strictures. Logic may be sufficient for an exceptional and solitary rational inquirer, a philosopher, but rhetoric is just what's needed, just what the philosopher ordered for reasonable citizens. Now, to be fair to Rousseau, his idea of this ideal city-state should be read as including reasonable citizens, since the general will properly take everyone's interests into account. It justifies democracy by appealing to the wisdom of the many, the empirical claim that a majority of many individuals is less likely to give a wrong answer than any one person. It's sort of like using the audience as one of your lifelines. And there's something to that. but it misses the real virtue of democracy. The real virtue is self-determination. What really matters is not that our laws and our policies are the best laws or the right policies. What matters is that they're our laws and our policies. Now, even if we lose a political argument, just participating in the deliberative process gives us some ownership over the policy. Now, you know the phenomenon if you've ever traveled abroad. You travel abroad and the citizens from other countries come up to you and say, how can you justify what Obama's doing? Or how can you justify what Bush is doing? Or how can you justify what Reagan is doing? As if it's your fault. And you claim, don't blame me, I didn't vote for the guy. That really is a kind of hollow defense. You are part of it. We do own our political decisions. So if we don't engage with the issues, we fail in our responsibilities as individual citizens. But the absence of public argumentation is a collective failure. It's a failure of our collective responsibility. The ability to engage in political argumentation is vital for sustaining participatory democracies. Now, arguing well requires a very diverse set of intellectual and interpersonal skills. Political argumentation has a skill set all its own. We want to focus on that. Now, arguments come in all colors, shapes, and sizes. Political argumentation has features that differentiate it from weighty scientific arguments, heated family arguments, episodic personal arguments between friends, abstract philosophical arguments, commercial arguments, merely academic arguments, high-stakes commercial arguments, higher stakes religious arguments, and those momentous, unresolvable, and wickedly delicious arguments between Red Sox fans and Yankee fans. I mean, they all represent useful contrast cases to political arguments, but I'm going to focus on just two examples, academic arguments and personal arguments. And the differences in both cases are quite striking, and I think they shed interesting light on political arguments. So first, consider arguments between friends or family members. The juxtaposition of political arguments and personal arguments is revealing, but I actually think it's more, in Wittgenstein's terms, reminding. It reminds us of things that we already know, but we lose sight of. So suppose two friends are arguing about a borrowed car that was returned with an empty gas tank. And the argument spirals out of control, and it threatens to end a 10 or 20-year friendship. Now, we can be sure of one thing. It's not really about the gas. There are other things going on, like simmering resentments or petty grievances coming to the surface. The argument is obviously just one episode in a much larger history. Oh, I suppose it could be about the gas, but anyone who would put a 10-year friendship at risk over an empty gas tank just doesn't know much about how to sustain friendships and doesn't know much about arguing either. Being good at arguing is about much more than just being able to win. It's also about picking the right fights, picking the right thing that matters. In personal and political arguments alike, it's often not about the gas. When senators block votes on judicial nominees, it's not about those nominees. We know this is how things work in politics, but we can lose sight of it when we argue. Of course, we can also forget that sometimes it really is about the gas, but I'll return to that point later. Here's an egregious example. In contemporary American politics, some Republicans suffer from Obama derangement syndrome, ODS. The term derives from Charles Krauthammer's earlier coinage, Bush derangement syndrome, and like that predecessor, it refers to the irrational knee-jerk hostility to anything said or done by the president in question. The Daily Show's Jon Stewart calls it Baracknophobia, and that word also has some coinage, some traction too. Birthers who still question the president's legitimacy long after it's been settled to everyone else's satisfaction, they have ODS, Obama derangement syndrome. But even members of Congress have been known to show advanced symptoms. In one truly amazing display of ODS, the Republican congressional leadership ended up unanimously opposing a motion to create a bipartisan commission on debt reduction that they themselves had co-sponsored once Obama signed on to it. Now, think about that. reasonable argumentation never had a chance. The reasons pro and con were completely irrelevant because the issue was not the issue. It wasn't about the gas. For them, it was all about Obama. Now, the second thing to take away from the comparison with personal arguments is that arguments have contexts. The immediate goal in any given argument includes winning, of course, and that dictates the tactics that would be involved in framing debates, answering objections, providing reasons, but larger contexts also call for long-term strategies. For example, if your conduct in one argument poisons the well for the next one, then your victory this time may be only a Pyrrhic victory. You've gained a tank of gas, but at the cost of a long-term friendship. Not a good trade. And the third takeaway is that when long-term considerations matter, as they do in politics, then reasonableness is a greater argumentative virtue than rationality. Logical and analytical skills just aren't enough. Marshalling evidence, seeing connections, and drawing conclusions, well, it's important, but so are negotiation and interpersonal skills that take others' interests into account. The talent for creative compromise is a great skill. So is the ability to create space for a face-saving exit, yours or your opponent's. Because rationality and reasonableness do tend to merge, if we aim for rationality to the exclusion of reasonableness, we're likely to miss them both. So how much of this is like political arguments? Well, I don't know. The split over the debt limit wasn't only about the debt limit. The same battle lines reappear with respect to a whole host of immediately connected issues like tax rates and government spending. And those same battle lines appear in more tangentially connected issues like same-sex marriage and educational reform. That's why it's important for President Obama and Speaker Boehner to have a communicative relation that extends beyond any one argument. Now let me juxtapose political arguments with academic arguments. It's also revealing, also reminding. We label arguments as merely academic to dismiss them. They have no real consequences. They concern esoteric beliefs instead of tangible actions. And there's no urgency about resolving academic disputes, which is actually pretty good because they hardly ever get resolved. I mean, it's a wonder, given the negative costs associated with arguing, that anyone ever enters into academic arguments. And yet we do. The logic and motivations behind academic arguments are intriguing, but that's really the subject for another paper. My concern tonight is the light that they shed on political arguments. And there are some really strikingly odd features of academic arguments. One odd feature, for example, is that there's no room for negotiation or compromise. There might be third options between two extremes, of course, or additional options that aren't even on that spectrum at all. But those would be alternatives rather than the results of negotiated compromise. You know, wave-particle duality theories didn't result from Newton and Huygens sitting down and agreeing to split the difference. It grew out of the inability of either theory to accommodate all the data, and the ability of the Copenhagen interpretation to graft pieces of those into a coherent, more or less coherent whole. That's not how political arguments are supposed to work. Second, and tied to that, there's no time limit on academic arguments. Filibustering is not an option. There's no escape. Throwing out red herrings to avoid argumentation, it gets you at best only a temporary reprieve. Academic arguments persist because of their potential epistemological payoff. Personal pride, professional prestige, partisan posturing aside, there's knowledge to be gained. That makes academic arguments theoretical disputes that are worthy intellectual exchanges. Areas of consensus have little potential for furthering human knowledge and understanding, and academic arguments then can be considered as potential occasions for intellectual progress. That's what an academic argument is, potential for progress. Can we think of a civic political argumentation that way? Probably not. I don't think we can think of political argumentations as potential occasions for political progress. Probably too hard to think of them that way. But this I'm pretty sure of. If we did think of them that way, we would argue a whole lot differently. I think the effects would be quite beneficial on how we argue. But the most curious feature of academic arguments is this. It's better to lose an academic argument than to win one. Let me explain. Suppose you and I are arguing about some thesis, thesis T. You believe it, I don't. After you disarm my objections and rebut my counterarguments, all to my satisfaction, you've answered my questions, you've disarmed my reasons, all I can say is, I guess you're right. T, thesis T. So, I've gained a new belief. And it's not just any belief, but it's a well-examined belief. That's what we're after in philosophy, right? Examined beliefs. It's a well-examined belief. It's articulated. It's been tested, battle-tested. It's been through the ringer, and it's come out. It's well-defined. It's a supported belief. I've got this brand new, well-supported belief. Okay, who won that argument? I mean, if arguments are win-lose situations, if we think of them as wars, then I have to be regarded as a loser. But I'm the one who gained something. I gained a valuable new belief, and I'm the only one who gained it. You didn't gain anything. So how come I'm the loser? Now, admittedly, this argument only works for purely academic arguments, and it's doubtful that there are any purely academic arguments, if only because academics are people, complete with careers and reputations and egos and all sorts of interests at stake. Here, too, it's often not just about the gas. But even when it is about the gas, the adversarial model for argumentation forces us into this awkward position of equating learning with losing. And that's perverse. It obscures the crucial insight that we can benefit from losing. We can benefit from arguing even when we lose, especially when we lose. Losing an argument about, I don't know, who has to do the dishes. Okay, it's hard to put a spin on that one to make that turn that one into a victory. But you can do it, actually. We can regard it maybe as a tactical defeat in a long-term campaign where that's part of the winning strategy is to lose about the argument about the dishes once in a while. Now, the bottom line here, there can be benefits from losing an argument. Some are cognitive, some are personal, and some are political. But those benefits are hard to get. It requires a special kind of know-how, argumentative know-how. Being a really good arguer involves more than just being good at winning arguments. Knowing how to argue well also means knowing when to argue, what to argue about, with whom to argue, as well as how to win and how to lose. We don't score very well here. The benefits of losing are available only to arguers who know how to lose well. Academics who should know better are rarely good at it. Academics can be so averse to admitting defeat that they'll resort to all manner of intellectual gymnastics to avoid it, to avoid admitting defeat, at least in person, on the spot. Later on, of course, things can change. Afterwards, in the privacy of our studies, we're actually better at absorbing and digesting and reconsidering. That's when minds get changed, not in the immediate context of an argument. The benefits for winners and losers, arguers, are not always immediate. And that's another takeaway. Don't expect argumentation to work instantaneously. So, why are we so bad at losing arguments? Now, the evidence from talk radio and campaign debates is clear. We don't argue well, and we especially do not lose well. The evidence from the congressional record is even clearer. Too many senators and representatives are willing to force a debilitating paralysis on the entire government rather than settle for anything short of total victory. And I think two factors are especially blameworthy for this situation. First, there's the adversarial argument is war paradigm. We think in terms of arguments as verbal warfare with winners and losers. And then there's the phenomenon that the Brazilian and Israeli scholars Marcelo Dascal and Amnon Knoll have labeled cognitive systemic dichotomization. It's a mouthful. It just refers to the clustering of lots of positions together, and we'll talk about that. They call them CSDs. Together, CSDs and the argument is more metaphor deform our political discourse. And since they're entrenched, fixed features of the political landscape, it really is hard not to be pessimistic about the state of our public discourse. Let's talk about the argument as war metaphor. The war metaphor affects how we think about arguments. It reflects how we think about arguments too. It reflects and affects how we talk about arguments. And it affects and informs how we argue. We want what? Powerful arguments. Arguments that are right on target. We want winning strategies that turn aside counterattacks. We seek arguments that are strong enough to pack enough punch to break through our opponent's defensive positions, forcing them to surrender. We don't want just knockdown arguments or even knockout arguments. We want killer arguments. Well, as long as we think of arguments as verbal warfare, the only outcomes we can envision are triumph and defeat. That is to say, glorious victory or ignominious humiliation. No wonder losing is so hard. We've set things up so that losing an argument is not just a loss, it's a mark against us personally. It's something shameful. We need other ways to think about arguments. Here's a story that might help. Another way of thinking about arguments. The congregation of an old synagogue was split by an argument. Some argued that the Shema prayer should be recited standing up, and others were adamant that that prayer should be chanted sitting down. And they argued, and they argued. And rather than let it tear them apart, they decided that when they hired a new rabbi, they would all agree to abide by the rabbi's new decision. And when they hired the new rabbi, a scholar of international repute, they all gathered around, and the elders gathered around. Rabbi, Rabbi, some of them asked, isn't the tradition that the Shema is said standing up? And the rabbi goes, no, that's not the tradition. And then the other said, aha, the tradition is that the Shema be said sitting down. No, that's not the tradition either. But Rabbi, we've been arguing about it for years. That's the tradition. I mean, the point is that argument can unite communities as well as divide them. When we stop arguing with each other, we lose something besides losing arguments. Perhaps we can take a cue from international diplomacy and think of them not as wars, but by some other euphemism. How about interventions? Or, I like the idea of notion building. Unfortunately, the war metaphor is just too entrenched in how we think and how we talk and how we argue. It's not going anywhere. Trying to change the adversarial model for argument is, face it, a losing battle. So we're going to remain, for the foreseeable future, bad losers. Now, when I say we're bad losers, I don't mean that we're bad losers because we're sore losers who have tantrums and huff and puff and stomp off the stage, although many of us are quite capable of that. We're bad losers because we are unable to benefit from losing an argument. And thinking of arguments as wars just makes it worse. Now let me turn to the other factor that I hold especially blameworthy for the current situation, and this is cognitive systemic dichotomizations, CSDs. And this is Descal and Knoll's term for the phenomenon of clustered political views. We adopt political positions not piecemeal, but really entire packages on a wide range of issues from across the entire political spectrum. We don't decide on issues individually. CSDs explain why, for example, if you know someone's position on the capital gains tax or on the inheritance tax or something like that, then you also have a pretty good idea of what that person is going to say about the balanced budget amendment or on the debt ceiling and a whole host of other issues, including things like environmental deregulation, healthcare, same-sex marriage, abortion, things that are pretty tangentially connected, if at all. Some of the connections are logical, sure. A broad principle like fiscal conservatism impacts many issues. So, there's no surprise when supporters of a balanced budget amendment are skeptical or even hostile of a large government program like Medicare. But what's the connection to social conservatism? What does tax policy have to do with gay rights or teaching evolution? The late philosopher Richard Rorty addressed this issue in his book, Achieving Our Country, and couldn't do any better than just shrug, pointing to the contingencies of history. Clusters have genealogies, the accidents of history. Things could have been different. We can imagine, for example, how civil rights might have remained among the constitutional issues in the conservative agenda, rather than being ceded to the liberals. Conversely, liberals might have stayed focused on unions and workplace issues rather than spending political capital on the environment, leaving conservation for conservatives. The connections among the components of our cognitive systemic dichotomizations range from logical implication to political expedience, from historical origins to even just psychological associations. Now, CSDs do have benefits. They bring benefits. No one can be an expert in all areas, and CSDs lend credibility to all of their component positions. CSDs let us plug into pre-existing networks of opinions. The fact that the people who agree with me politically when it comes to issues A, B, and C take such a position on question D is relevant. That's important information. Hey, those are my people. Our CSDs help define who we are. But there's also a downside to CSDs. They make it harder to lose in a number of ways. First, our egos get in the way. We take arguments personally. We think that when we lose an argument, it's about us, the arguers, not about the issues. Second, these conceptual entanglements that constitute CSDs, they work like centrifugal forces, taking things off in lots of directions, making it difficult to stay focused on just one issue. And third, we enter into arguments with unrealistic expectations about how our reasons will affect others, and almost no expectations about how their reasons might affect us. We don't have any exit strategies. CSDs make it hard to be reasonable. Let me address those in turn: egos and centrifugal forces, and then expectations and exit strategies. Egos are the first obstacle. They complicate arguing in several ways. First, we see losing an argument as losing face. But in that regard, losing a political argument is no different than losing in any other contest, losing at tennis or at chess. But losing arguments is different. We identify with our side in the contest. This certainly happens in other contexts too, not just political contexts. All you have to do is listen to Red Sox fans, right? They don't say they lost last night or they won last night. They say we lost, we won. There's this identification. It's taken personally. But as tough as it may be in Red Sox Nation, it's much worse in American politics. Well, I might be able to understand how someone can disagree with me on topic A or question B, or with a little effort, even on wedge issue C. But it's impossible for me to understand how someone can disagree with me across the board on A and B and C. It's too much. They must live in a fantasy world. They're delusional. Even if I were inclined to join them on question D, I don't want to, because I don't want to be one of them. Maybe you think the deficit is out of control, but darned if you'll join those crazy racists in the Tea Party. Or maybe you think that deregulating Wall Street did let them rape the economy, but there's no way you're going to march with those crazy communists and occupy Wall Street. CSDs make us think in terms of us versus them. Those folks are nuts. These are my people over here. My political views reflect my values. They reveal who I am in an important way. Some losses don't matter very much. They prove I'm a mediocre tennis player and a worse chess player. Big deal. So what? But losing a political argument is different. It strikes at who I am. Checkmate me if you can, but at least I'm not one of them. I'm not, the sort of person who put a Backman for President bumper sticker on their car. Let me talk about the entanglements now. CSDs account for these, what I'm calling centrifugal forces in political argumentation? Questions from across the political agenda are all woven into a mesh of conceptual, social, and historical connections. So it's almost impossible to focus on individual strands. If we can't separate the arguments, if we can't separate the issues and our own thoughts, we won't be able to separate them in our arguments. Now, as arguments progress, we look around for more and more reasons to support our positions as arguments continue. We lose sight of the boundaries between topics, which are fluid anyway. It's all too easy to start out arguing about abortion, for example, and end up arguing about women's rights or the death penalty. It may happen organically as the argument unfolds, but it can also be a deliberate strategy. After all, how can anyone resist throwing pro-lifers' support of the death penalty back in their faces when they cite the sanctity of life in opposition to abortion? And surely it's fair to ask someone who defends keeping abortions legal as part of a women's right to choose in opposition to patriarchal hegemony, whether that right extends to using abortion as a means of sex selection for infants, for babies, as is common in many countries. From the death penalty in one context, in one direction, or sex selection in the other, it's a small step to penal systems, incarceration rates, and drug laws, or in the other direction, third world poverty, globalization, and corporate oligarchy. Now, these are actually, I think, fine rhetorical and dialectical strategies in one-on-one political arguments, but they play out differently in civil discourse, in public argumentation. When Republicans attach a pro-life rider to, say, a foreign aid appropriations bill, it's not in the service of argument at all. It's not an academic argument searching for truth. It's a procedural ploy to prevent reasoned argument, reasoned deliberation. It's a ploy to prevent legislative action rather than an argumentative move to try and reach a resolution. As an argumentative strategy, it may be unobjectionable, being careful, of course, to resist falling into ad hominem argumentation or red herring arguments, but there is much less to be said for it as a political maneuver. Together, these two effects of cognitive systemic dichotomizations, that is, how personally invested we become in our particular cluster of issues, and how our political worldview becomes knotted together, these make it impossible to have any rational exit strategy for arguments. And here's why. If the only measure of argumentative success is victory, and that means rationally persuading your opponent on a political question, but changing her position on that question requires her changing her position on a host of other questions, which goes to the heart of who she is as a person, then winning a political argument requires much more than just bringing about a change of mind. It requires something like a wholesale conversion. She would have to alter her position on the issue at hand, and more. She would have to see the whole world through an entirely different lens. She would have to become a different person. Now, conversion is an interesting phenomenon, interesting cognitive epistemological phenomenon, but it is always in part a non-logical process. Now, that's not to say that it's an illogical process, it's just that there are always extra-logical factors involved. Political arguments seem to demand conversion because cognitive systemic dichotomizations include non-logical, again, not necessarily illogical, but non-logical connections. So, if arguments' only resources are logical, then CSDs cannot be defeated by rational argumentation. So, let's not be rational. Let's be reasonable. Let me end by trying to weave some of these strands about political argumentation specifically and argumentation generally back together to find ways to win and lose arguments better. Everything I've said points to the conclusion that it's almost impossible to win a political argument. That's what grounds my pessimism. But it rests on two ideas. On the two ideas that winning requires total conversion, and that argumentation is limited to the narrowly logical or rational. but neither of those has to be so. Victories can be partial or incremental. Arguers can be reasonable as well as rational. So the door is open for optimism. It may be wishful thinking, but it's not unreasonable. Well, to start undoing the knot, let's reverse the perspective. Instead of asking what makes it possible for us to win an argument, and that's how logic texts and argumentation texts are geared, how to win an argument. It's the title of several logic texts, how to win an argument. Let's ask not how we can win an argument, but what would make it possible for them to win an argument against us? That is to say, under what conditions and in what manner and to what extent are we prepared to lose an argument? What would be the optimal circumstances for us to change our minds about something? Now, I don't like to lose. I don't think anyone does. Nothing can actually make it pleasant, but some things make it especially unpleasant. Eliminating them would help. So the idea is this. If we can identify what makes it harder for us to lose, then we can figure out what would make it easier for us to lose. And presumably, if we know what makes it easier for us to lose, we'll also know what makes it easier for them to lose. And if we know what makes it easier for them to lose, we have just figured out what makes it easier for us to win. That's the strategy. Now, simply by framing the question this way, what would help us change our minds? I think we've made a lot of progress. The argument is war trope, remember, makes us think of retreating, being forced to yield, surrendering. Instead, we're now taking the opposing viewpoint into account. But that's just being reasonable. Well, okay, what are the really toxic elements? What's really bad about losing? Having to admit that I was wrong is pretty hard. But having to hear someone else tell me I was wrong, that's worse. And hearing about the litany of other failures that I have that aren't about the gas tank, that's even worse. That's really salt in the wounds. I think all of these particularly toxic features can be eliminated, can be reversed. First, saving face matters. But arguments shouldn't be about the arguers. It should be about the topic of the argument. Now, in one way, arguments are always about the arguers, but perhaps not as we always recognize, and certainly not as we always intend. Wittingly or not, when we argue with someone, we implicitly dignify them. When we argue with people, we treat them as as agents who are reasons responsive. They are reasons responsive individuals. We don't argue with animals, we don't argue with infants, or madmen, or machines, or the weather. Well, not seriously anyway. So part of being reasonable is just recognizing the reasonableness of our fellow arguers. To argue with someone is to dignify them, is to recognize that they are part of the reasons responsive kingdom. It's unreasonable to argue with anyone else. So when we do argue, we expect that the power of our reasons, which we find so compelling, will be recognized by others immediately, and they will then instantaneously convert to our side of the argument. Well, after all, they're reasons responsive, right? And so why shouldn't they respond to our reasons? Well, it doesn't work that way, or hardly ever seems to work out that way. Why not? Well, the reason has less to do with who is arguing than what's being argued about. Just as we dignify opponents by entering into arguments with them, we also implicitly dignify their positions by being willing to argue about it. We dignify their positions by treating them as something worth arguing about. We don't argue with irrational people, but neither do we argue about irrational subjects, unreasonable subjects. No one bothers to argue about truisms or absurdities or trivialities. Philosophers aside, we don't do that. We argue about things that are both arguable, unsettled, and worthy of argument, not trivial. All the positions on the table in a political argument have some reasons behind them in support. So having good reasons for your position is not enough. An argument that doesn't acknowledge the reasons for its rivals is not a reasonable argument. Now that brings us back to politics, and I'm going to end here, because if anything is both arguable and worthy of argument, it's politics, where reasons abound. These are topics that deserve good arguments. There are reasons on all sides. It's not to say that they're all always good reasons, but they're there and they need to be taken into account. Furthermore, because political argumentation takes place in the thicket of cognitive systemic dichotomizations, being reasonable requires, first, respecting our opponent's motivations, their values, their goals, and two, respecting how the given issue fits into the galaxy, the whole constellation of other political issues constituting their CSD, but also three, how the issue at hand fits into our own cognitive systemic dichotomization, into our cluster of political beliefs. What that means is the goal of, total victory ending in complete conversion of the other is an unreasonable goal. It's not going to happen. Conversely, the specter of total defeat ending in complete annihilation and conversion is an unreasonable fear. It's not going to happen. So, is being reasonable enough? Perhaps. I think it is. I think it might be. But I remain pessimistic because the simple expedient to be reasonable is not at all simple. Reasonableness, as I've tried to assert here, is a greater virtue than rationality when it comes to argument, but it's also harder to achieve. Rationality is easy. Any PC can be rational in that sense, but reasonableness is the art of being human. It's a greater virtue, it's harder to achieve. For one thing, there's no such thing as being too reasonable. You can be too rational, I think. That phrase makes sense? Was Mr. Spock too rational in Star Trek? Maybe. But you can't be too reasonable. You achieve a certain degree of reasonableness, the goalpost is moved. There's more. The goalposts keep moving. Also, the boundaries between our reasons and our rationalizations, that's a really blurry boundary. And it's even blurry to the most self-aware, keenest observers of most self-aware thinkers. And CSDs make it virtually invisible, the boundary line between reasons and rationalizations. The non-logical connections that hold heterogeneous worldviews together make it impossible to tell whether we are or not being reasonable, or are not being reasonable on any given occasion. It makes it impossible to tell whether we're, in fact, arguing about the gas or not, or more important, whether we should be arguing about the gas or something else. So, optimism about the state of our polity can be based on the idea that all we need to do is just be reasonable, but pessimism reappears from a realization of just how unreasonable that demand is. Thank you.
If you have any questions, please speak in the microphone, or we'll ask for the microphone.
That was really interesting. Thank you, Dan.
Well, it might just be rationalization trying to explain why it's a good thing that I lose arguments all the time.
Well, that's a worthy enterprise. As philosophers, we always lose arguments, of course, because all of our arguments are defective in some way. One of the things that I kept coming back to as I listened to you was the notion of an argument. You use argument to cover a lot of territory. Argument describes what went on between Socrates and Thrasymachus, just as it describes what goes on between Rick Perry and Mitt Romney. And I'm wondering if you have a formulation of what an argument is, and a formulation that would cover that wide range. And I'm also, I guess, wondering implicitly, when the thread becomes so thin that it starts to break, that we have really different sorts of things going on.
Terrific question, and it really is at the heart of the matter. What is an argument? I think the whole concept is a camel of a construction. And you know what a camel is? It's a horse designed by a committee. So that's what the concept of argument is. Here are three, let's call them metaphors or models or paradigms for argument. One, here's the use of argument. Here's my argument. I lay out my premises, my inferences. The mathematician's or the logician's argument, it's a product. And that's argument is proof. That's pretty much a logical notion of argument. But here's another one. Argument is a kind of warfare. That seems to be the dominant metaphor in our way of talking. It's all adversariality. It doesn't really matter what they're arguing about or how good the inferences are. It's all about winning and losing. Let's call that the dialectical account of argument. And then there's a third kind of argument, and I associate this with the rhetorical movement move. An argument has a performative aspect, that you're always arguing with someone before some people. There's audiences that are involved, and you can think now not of a mathematician's argument or a lawyer, a debate team, but a lawyer making a case or a politician before a crowd presenting a case. And I think that all of those are operative in how we think of arguments. The attempt to define argument, well, I gotta say I engaged in that at times and in earlier writings, and I've almost despaired. But here's a definition that I think is nice, and it doesn't work, but it's nice. And criticizing the argument is not criticizing this definition is not working. It's like criticizing Moby Dick because, well, it didn't really happen. It's all fiction. It misses the point. A Dutch scholar defined an argument this way: an argument is any attempt to make the speech act, which is the conclusion of the argument, more acceptable. What I like about this argument, about this definition, is it allows for arguments that lead to imperatives or questions you can justify, offer reasons for asking a question, for example. The speech act, which is the conclusion, trying to make it more acceptable. So, how do you make something more acceptable? You offer reasons for it, or you explain it better. Explanation is a kind of argument, making it more palatable. Saying it with a smile, is that kind of argument? Well, maybe so, but here's one of my favorite arguments in I don't know, in the last 120 years. Sometime at the turn of the last century, Picasso started painting things in very weird ways with these cubes and said, and he didn't argue this is how the world looks or this is how it should be painted. And yet within a few years, a lot of other painters were painting that way. That is, his argument was more of an invitation. Here's a way to see things, rather than the push, the force, the compel of you gotta, if you believe this, then you've gotta believe that too. That's a kind of argument. So it's a way of what? If we buy into the dominant, probably the dominant understanding of arguments in contemporary argumentation theory is the pragmadialectical school out of the Netherlands, which treats arguments as attempts at resolving differences. So they are clearly dialectical, clearly situating them in social contexts. That's closer to what I think is what's relevant. The purely logical aspect of argumentation, we're pretty good at that. We don't need work on that one.
Depending on the extension of we.
Yeah, that's true.
Hi. You briefly talked about filibusters in domestic politics as a way of argumentation, but I was curious to know your viewpoints of the United Nations and how you would suggest smaller countries with less of a voice that don't have preferred nation status and how they could win an argument in the UN. And the case I was thinking about is with Rwanda and the genocide there, and how some countries viewed it as reasonable for the U.S. to intervene and give aid where other people or other countries saw it as irrational.
Okay, let me divide that into two questions, because I do want to correct one thing. Filibusters are an interesting kind of argument. But in my more sober moments, I don't think they're arguments at all. You know, if I come to evaluate arguments, and let's say I bring to bear Aristotle's list of fallacies, or I take a logic and think about ways that arguments go wrong, you can't criticize an argument for being red herring or ad hominem or ad baculum because there's no argument going on at all. You can get up there and read the phone book. That's a way of filibustering. And the logical structure is completely irrelevant. So I don't think of arguments, I don't think of filibusters as fallacies in arguments. I think of them as blockades to arguing. They are not missteps within an argument, they're a way of avoiding an argument. I think of a filibuster as essentially no better than blah, 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 as a way of avoiding an argument. So I don't think of them as bad arguments. I think that they are argumentative failures to engage in an argument in the first place. There are other kinds of filibusters too, and it's an effective strategy if you've been around a 4-year-old. Why is that? Because, why? Because, why? There's no end to that. That's you're being filibustered. All right already. But the second point, how do we make ourselves heard? We have lots of ways of making ourselves heard, but we don't really have effective means of making others listen. And partly that's because we're such bad listeners ourselves. Does this apply to countries in the United Nations as agents? Boy, it's a little bit out of my pay grade, so I'm gonna have to ask you, what kind of argument would work? So if you're the UN representative, the US representative to the UN, what kind of arguments are you going to hear? I don't mean to put it on you. I do mean to put it on you.
I would assume, I know you talked about like abortion, and I think it would be like international arguments, so way out of my league. But I think what I was thinking of when I asked the question was I feel like a lot of times if you're not one of the 5, you can just get shot down. So, I mean, it's great if you're the U.S. or the other people that won the Cold War, but
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that the argumentation that goes on in the UN is not argumentation. It's political maneuvering. It's about having your way rather than trying to either find a truth or find resolution. I don't think that most of the political argumentation that goes on in the Senate, for example, the U.S. Senate, is about trying to settle differences. I mean, think back. Here's another egregious case. Back in the 90s, when Bill Clinton was being impeached, there were all these speeches in the Senate, and you know, and I know, and they knew that those speeches didn't convince anyone of anything, and they weren't going to convince anyone of anything. They served some different purpose rather than argumentation. It wasn't about offering reasons in a reasons-responsive situation. That wasn't the context. The speeches were for constituencies. It was to cover their posteriors. It was, I don't know, they were regardez-moi moments rather than attempts at getting somewhere, getting to a truth or getting to a resolution or finding some agreeable. It certainly wasn't about rational persuasion of anybody. The fact remains, no one in the Senate was convinced by anything that anyone else in the Senate had to say. Clearly, then they're doing something else. Boy, let's take that to the government department and see how they can explain it. I can't. What would I tell the representative from Rwanda? Keep trying, speak louder, appeal to the common ground that you have with other people. You're not trying to, you don't want to make them believe things they don't want to believe. You want to make them want to believe those things. You want to make them understand. Sorry.
So it appears that there isn't a sort of large-scale lack of, at least in the political realm, people being unable to argue. It's not the case that people don't have the requisite tools to argue. They are very often educated folks who are equipped with bare minimal skills to put forward good arguments. So it seems as if what you're saying is lacking is the perhaps the moral rightfulness, the arguing about an issue for the sake of arguing about an issue with the intention of resolving that issue. That is what is lacking, because people do have the skills to argue.
Let me focus on just one thing you said. When we're dealing with people who have, how did you put it, the ability, the resources to construct a good argument, what's the sense of argument there in which it's a good argument? I think that there are lots of senses of what counts as a good argument. One is, does it pass logical muster? Another is it successful? Does it win? Another is, does it succeed in bringing about a resolution rather than mere settlement, where settlement can just be done by force, but a real conviction rather than mere persuasion. Here's what I want to replace that concept of good argument with, those concepts of good argument. For me, a good argument is one that the arguers can walk away and say, boy, that was a good argument. And that involves not just the winners and the losers, because the winners actually do gain something. In arguing with you, my position gets refined, gets improved, I hope. If I argue with you and I don't come away from better, that wasn't a good argument. So how can we think about good arguments that way? Let me bring in something, and I think it applies here. The concept of good used in what's called the Good Works Project down in Harvard. Anyone know about this, the Good Works Project? It says the basic premise is that there are three senses of good work that need to be woven together to come up with a coherent, more robust, workable notion of good work. We talk about good work in these three senses. You hire a carpenter to do a job, and they do it well. They do technically proficient. So one concept of good work is technically excellent, competent work. And yes, we're all good arguers in that sense. We can competently construct valid arguments. Some of us can. Second concept of good work. You're looking for a job. You want good work in that sense that's fulfilling and rewarding, not just something to put a sandwich on the table at lunchtime. You want rewarding work. But the third sense of good work is the one that the missionaries who went to do good but stayed and did well. Good work in the moral sense. I want to weave those together in the sense of a good argument is one that the losers and the winners can walk away with it saying, yeah, that was a good argument because I benefited from it. We made progress from it. Not just the winners and the losers, but the audience and the judges and even the collateral damage to the kids who see the parents arguing. That's not a good argument. Regardless of the content, that's not a good argument. Well, I want to weave them together. Because I think if you neglect the technical competence and the rewarding aspect of it, you've missed something really important. That there has to be the cognitive component also. But again, I don't think you can separate the cognitive and the ethical. So, tell me I've read too much Damasio. Sure, guilty as charged.
Following on from that, it strikes me that there are in many spheres win-lose situations about which one can say one lost beautifully or elegantly. In a soccer match, one could lose elegantly, beautifully, and one could praise the loser for the way that they played. And we're much less prone to do this certainly in philosophical discourse or in political discourse, that when one loses, and I really hate the construction of winning and losing with respect to argumentations, there's something globally degrading about it, all the more so because it's often a spectacle, and when we argue, we're in part attempting to win the endorsement, the affection, the respect of those observing us.
Okay, this really isn't to answer the question, but
wasn't really a question.
but it's a story that I've been itching to tell, and maybe I can squeeze it in here because it has to do with the fact that when we argue, we take ownership of the position in a way that we don't in soccer matches. And there is no algorithm for deciding who wins and loses. That there are lots of things. It's an art. It really is an art form. And again, the story concerns not a synagogue this time, but a yeshiva school. That was a school of scholars, and they argued about how to interpret the Torah and how to interpret the Talmud and the commentaries. And one particular passage was particularly difficult to interpret, and there was an argument about how to interpret it. And they argued, as the tradition demands. And again, it threatened to tear apart the yeshiva, and they didn't want that to happen. So they took their 6 best scholars, formed a super committee, I guess you'd say, and they said, you scholars argue about it, come to a conclusion, and we all will accept your conclusion here, your resolution. And so the six rabbis, the 6 scholars went into the room, and they argued. There were 5 old, distinguished rabbis and 1 young, up-and-coming, sharp guy. And they argued, and the oldest rabbi said, we've been arguing for hours now. Let's see where we stand. How many opt for interpretation A? And the 5 old rabbis raised their hand. Interpretation B? The 1 young guy. 5-1. What can we do? Let's argue some more. They argued for hours more. At the end, the rabbi said, let's take another straw vote. Still 5-1. And they did it again and again, still 5-1. And finally, the old rabbi said, we're all pious men of goodwill. Let's pray for guidance. And so they prayed, and out of the sky came a loud voice, the young rabbi is right. The old rabbi looks up and goes, okay, so now it's 5-2. You don't get out of it that way. Argumentation is our way of manifesting our rationality. Getting it right or wrong isn't the most important thing. Look, there aren't that many argumentation jokes, so that's it. So yes, there's no algorithm. It's the art of being human. It's manifest rationality, in Ralph Johnson's felicitous phrase.
I found very interesting your criticism of the war metaphors with argument, killer arguments, knockdown arguments, counterattacks, and so forth. And I agree with you that there's some toxicity in there and in our culture when we talk that way. But at the same time, I wonder how far you can go with that. I mean, suppose we got rid of all those metaphors and just didn't use them anymore when we were arguing. How much of a change would that really be? It seems to me that with arguments, they're not all created equal. Some arguments are better than others. Some are stronger, some are weaker. Some are more plausible and more convincing, others are not. And I don't see how you can get away from that kind of evaluative language. And if that's correct, then how are we going to be in a different position if we get rid of the war metaphors?
Okay, the first thing is, the war metaphor both reflects how we think about arguments, but it also informs how we argue. It's doing both of those things. It really fits, and it is hard to get around it, whether we think of arguments as I don't know, dancing, or lots of ways to think about it. It's a good metaphor. It really does capture a lot of how we argue. And it's a good metaphor in the sense that we can still extract lots of meaning from it. For example, if we think of arguments as wars, we're trying to describe arguments using the vocabulary of warfare, then maybe we can ask about, gee, is there a parallel distinction between what's Walter's distinction between jus in bellum and jus ad bellum, justice in war and justice in going to war? Is there a comparable distinction to be made in argumentation theory? Yes, because I think right now argumentation theory is very bad at answering the question, why, when should we argue? When's the right time to argue? When's the wrong time to argue? The mere fact of difference, not every difference, should be elevated into an argument. Or, take another example, in war we worry about things like collateral damage. Do we worry about that in arguments? Does that concept transfer over? Maybe it does. Maybe the parents arguing in front of the children ought to take into account that there's collateral damage to this exchange. So I think that there's meaning to be mined from that comparison. It hasn't exhausted itself yet. On the other hand, it's not a forced metaphor on us. There are alternatives. We could, in fact, think of arguing as barn raising or dancing or I once gave this as an exercise to a class in philosophy of language on metaphors. And I said, okay, come up with different metaphors for arguing. And people sort of scratched their head and stared at their shoes and did all the things they do when they can't think of anything offhand. And slowly a sort of trickle came out. Maybe it's like boxing with low blows. Okay, you can be saved by the bell, I suppose. But still, that's a very adversarial moment. And in sports metaphors, the boxing is the one that is most common when talking about arguments. Someone said arguing is throwing stones into the ocean and having them wash back, which was beautiful and no one understood it. And it was a very halting kind of proposals. And then someone said, well, maybe arguments are like traffic jams in conversation. And someone else said, yeah, they're gridlock, a lot of noise and no movement. And someone else said, no, it's sort of like when you get stuck on a roundabout. Or maybe it's two-way traffic on a one-way road. Or maybe it's merging traffic. Or maybe it's a road under construction. Or maybe it's roadkill. It didn't work so well. But it was like a floodgate had opened, and there were all these metaphors that applied. Now, that probably says more about our relationship to cars and traffic, that those metaphors wouldn't come out in maybe other societies. But it does show that there are other ways of talking about these things. And the traffic metaphors actually work pretty well. There's an awful lot of interesting, and there's dozens more that I didn't even get to. So the metaphors are malleable. Do they trap us? Maybe. I mean, if you read, I don't know, Lakoff and Johnson on metaphors, they talk about how we do get trapped by our metaphors, that we sing high notes because, are they high because we have to do that?
But my question is,
yeah.
regardless of what metaphor one uses to talk about arguments, aren't there still going to be winners and losers when the argument's over?
That's one way to describe what's going on. It's not the only way. It doesn't have to be the most important way. And if we think of arguments as, let's say, merging traffic or roads under construction, or let's think of them as a town meeting, coming up with suggestions, barnstorming rather than barn raising. If we think of them as barnstorming, let's hash it out rather than fight it out. The conversation will proceed very differently if we're hashing something out rather than fighting it out. Now, you're right. That doesn't apply to all arguments. Some arguments really are adversarial. It's going to be either you or me doing the dishes, and it really would be much better for all these reasons if it were you. So yeah, there's winners and losers. We're not going to get rid of the metaphor. I don't think we should get rid of the metaphor, but I do think it shouldn't be the only one on the table for thinking about arguments. And yes, and I also think, as examples of jus ad bello and jus in bellum and collateral damage, sieges, I think all of these terms have applications that we haven't yet explored, and they do provide a template for looking at arguments and seeing connections that we otherwise would miss. So there's life in that old metaphor yet.
Dan, somebody's, okay, go ahead.
I have a quick question about children and how you might see the arguments that we have all had as children relating to adults arguing. And also, would you say that the skills in argument and arguing are inherent or learned, developed?
Well, there are some cultural differences in how people argue. And this has to do with, histories and cultures and societies. For example, the Tibetan Buddhists have this really interesting tradition of arguing. It's very stylized. It's probably closest to forensic debate among universities, where there are arcane rules and you train in it for a long time, But the operative principle seems to be, if you win every argument, you are not arguing with the right people yet. You're sort of test to break. You do best. You learn when you lose. It's a very Buddhist thing to say. We don't do that. Now, as for children's arguments, they learn. Here's a case. In thinking about, the formula I want to try and articulate and flesh out is that a good argument is one in which the arguers argue well. I want to turn the adjective into an adverb. Think about argue. And what is it for an arguer to argue well? And lately I've been thinking in terms of Aristotelian virtue ethics. What are the virtues of arguers? What makes someone into a good arguer? Well, open-mindedness and a sense of proportion, those kinds of things. Sincerity, I think, is actually an interesting virtue. And here's an example that I think gets this, maybe can bring this out. So you're telling your 4-year-old, so it's time to go to bed. And they're resisting. I want to stay up. I want to see the next TV show, or I want to play one more game on the computer. They're arguing. And you try and give them reasons. And you say, well, it's almost December, and Santa Claus is coming and doesn't reward the children, the bad children. But staying up late's not bad because you do it. Oh no, it's about obedience to parents. And okay, so you convince them. Now, there is something to be said for that. You've convinced them by rational means. You haven't resorted to violence. You've argued from premises that they accept. But still, I wouldn't hold that up as an example of a good argument because you are insincere. So I think that in thinking about what makes an argument a good argument, you can't just focus on, is it premises that are acceptable to the audience? Do the conclusions follow from the premise and so on? There's got to be more to it than that. That good here is, I don't know whether it's a family resemblance concept or a category of concepts or not a together robust concept. And that's sort of where I'm thinking right now. You don't like that one? I'm open to being convinced on this. So, arguing isn't. I don't know. Talk to childhood development authorities on this one, but I strongly suspect that it's learned behavior. How we argue reflects how we've been argued with, how we were treated as children. At what point did your parents start treating you as a reasons-responsive individual rather than just a, little blob of epsilon, little protoplasm that has to be dealt with? Arguing is a way to dignify people. And when you argue with your children as an equal, that really models something important. So thank you for that question.
I have one question about political arguments, and I suppose I don't think there's a scientific way, unless I'm told. I'm sure I'm wrong in some ways, but I don't think there's a scientific way to judge, to evaluate the outcome of a political argument. For example, if we had two people arguing right in this room, a Democrat and a Republican, and there was 60% of this audience were to be Democrats and 40% Republican, I could reasonably predict the outcome of this argument. So how does one decide a political argument with a divided and partisan polity?
One of the sort of, I think, really horrible features of the American landscape is that we are segregated along various lines. Now, we're segregated along ethnic and racial lines, political lines, class lines, level of education. Who you socialize with is largely a function of lots of factors. And we don't actually cross too many of those lines. And it's been like that forever. But I don't think that anyone who's looked at it would say that when it comes to things like racial segregation, we're worse off now than we were 50 years ago. Sure, it's still there. but it's not worse than it was 50 years ago. Education lines, I don't know if it's worse than it was 50 years ago. But I do think that the political segregation, polarization, is worse than it was 50 years ago. That is, 50 years ago, if I went to a party, I wouldn't make assumptions about the politics of the people there. But now when I walk into a room, I just assume a whole lot about their politics. And we don't socialize across political lines very well anymore. And I think that that's getting worse. What can you do to fix that? I mean, do you have friends that you socialize with? Not acquaintances, not work people, because you don't have any choice in that. But do you have friends that you can argue politics with, that you disagree with across the board? And that's a rare thing. I'm lucky I have some friends that I can argue with whom I disagree. One of my close friends is a political columnist who is a great arguer because he's smart. He knows a lot. He listens well. If you make a good point, he will acknowledge it. And the downside is if he makes a good point, he expects you to acknowledge it. And best of all, he is reliably wrong about everything. I love arguing with this guy. And what's especially good about him is that when we argue, I think we each take away something from it. I learn from him. I hope he learns from me. And we know not to take it personally. And so, whenever Colby needs a panel with two voices, they often get the two of us. Because I can argue with this guy. And we know how, academics are actually pretty good at this. I didn't always know this, but this is one semester I was teaching at Victoria University in New Zealand. And I was a visitor there and trying hard to take advantage of everything that my time there had to offer. And the philosophy department said, we have this colloquium every other Wednesday where we take turns giving papers, and would you be interested in participating? I said, absolutely, I want to do this. Well, it's very much the British style of philosophy, sort of what some people here call the extra chromosome philosophers, who really, they think of it as a full contact sport. Well, I went to the first colloquium, and it was some graduate students who gave, I thought, very good papers. And there was some push, but then there was some pushback. But I later discovered they were being treated with kid gloves, but they really handled themselves well. And the second paper was, 2 weeks later, was someone working in formal logic who presented results. And it was an intriguing result, complicated, but not many assertions that you could challenge. There were questions, and gee, what do you make of this? And you could disagree about the importance of it, but really not a whole lot of arguing. And then I gave my paper, was the third one. And I guess I hadn't expected what was the norm. I gave a paper, and I used two offensive words in the same talk that just really were red flags to the New Zealand philosophy department. The words were feminism and Wittgenstein. And I was exploring the intersection of those two concepts. And the experience was one that I guess is common in British universities, but foreign to me, is having people not that far away from me screaming at me at the top of their lungs, saying, "You can't say that, that's intellectual fraud," screaming that loud, top of their lungs, and going at it for an hour. I'm shell-shocked. It ended, and then everybody got up and walked across the street to the pub. Now, there's an art form in being able to do that, and I hadn't yet figured that out. And so maybe the whole talk is a response to that traumatization that I suffered. But that's an art form, being able to argue, even passionately, but not personally. Not taking yes, disagreeing with me isn't attacking me. That's something that's a really hard lesson to learn. Academics, by and large, are pretty good at that, but only pretty good.
Well, on this note, we conclude this session, and we thank Professor Dan
thank you.
Cohen. Thank you so much.